Mr. Jenner, Mr. Staines, and Mr. Dodd the surgeon now passed me, their countenances sufficiently expressing their sense of the situation in which we all were. Mr. Burns spoke cheerfully to me. He bade me take good courage, and Mr. Jenner observed, there was a good shore near, and all would do well. These gentlemen then went to the side of the ship, with the intention, as I believe, of seeing whether it was possible to get on shore. The master of the vessel alone remained near the companion, when suddenly a tremendous wave broke over the ship and struck me with such violence that I was stunned for a moment, and before being able to recover myself, the ship struck with a force so great as to throw me from the stairs into the cabin, the master being thrown down near me. At the same instant, the cabin, with a dreadful crash, broke in upon us, and planks and beams threatened to bury us in ruins. The master, however, soon recovered himself. He left me to go again upon deck, and I saw him no more. A sense of my condition lent me strength to disengage myself from the boards and fragments by which I was surrounded, and I once more got upon the stairs, I hardly know how. But what a scene did I behold! The masts were all lying across the shattered remains of the deck, and no living creature appeared on it. All was gone, though I knew not then that they were gone forever. I looked forward to the shore, but there I could see nothing except the dreadful surf that broke against it, while behind the ship, immense black waves rose like tremendous ruins. I knew that they must overwhelm her, and thought that there could be no escape for me. Believing, then, that death was immediate and unavoidable, my idea was to regain my bed in the cabin, and there, resigning myself to the will of God, await the approaching moment. However, I could not reach it, and for a while was insensible. Then the violent striking and breaking up of the wreck again roused me to recollection. I found myself near the cabin windows, PG 291, and the water was rising round me. It rapidly increased, and the horrors of drowning were present to my view, yet do I remember seeing the furniture of the cabin floating about. I sat almost enclosed by pieces of the wreck, and the water now reached my breast. The bruises I had received made every exertion extremely difficult, and my loose gown was so entangled among the beams and fragments of the ship that I could not disengage it. Still the desire of life, the hope of being welcomed on shore, whither I thought my friends had escaped, and the remembrance of my child, all united in inspiring me with courage to attempt saving myself. I again tried to loosen my gown, but found it impossible, and the wreck continued to strike so violently, and the ruins to close so much more around me, that I now expected to be crushed to death. As the ship drifted higher on the stones, the water rather lessened as the waves went back, but on their return continued to cover me, and I once or twice lost my breath, and for a moment my recollection. When I had power to think, the principle of self-preservation still urged me to exertion. The cabin now broke more and more, and through a large breach I saw the shore very near. Amidst the tumult of the raging waves, I had a glimpse of the people, who were gathering up what the sea drove towards them, but I thought they could not see me, and from them I despaired of assistance. Therefore I determined to make one effort to preserve my life. I disengaged my arms from the dressing gown, and finding myself able to move, I quitted the wreck, and felt myself on the ground. I attempted to run, but was too feeble to save myself from a raging wave, which overtook and overwhelmed me. Then I believed myself gone, yet half suffocated as I was, I struggled very much, and I remember that I thought I was very long dying. The wave left me, I breathed again, and made another attempt to get higher upon the bank, but quite exhausted, I fell down, and my senses forsook me. By this time, I was observed by some of the people on the bank, and 2 men came to my assistance. They lifted me up. I once more recovered some faint recollection, and as they bore me along, I was sensible that one of them said the sea would overtake us, that he must let me go and take care of his own life. I only remember clinging to the other and imploring him not to abandon me to the merciless waves. But I have a very confused idea of what passed till I saw the boat, into which I was to be put to cross the Fleet water. PG 292, I had then just strength to say, "For God's sake, do not take me to sea again." I believe the apprehension of it, added to my other sufferings, tended to deprive me of all further sensibility, for I have not the least recollection of anything afterwards, until roused by the remedies applied to restore me in a farmhouse whither I was carried. There I heard a number of women around me who asked a great number of questions which I was unable to answer. I remember hearing one say I was a French woman, another say that I was a Negro, and indeed I was so bruised and in such a disfigured condition that the conjectures of these people are not surprising. When recovering some degree of confused recollection and able to speak, I begged that they would allow me to go to bed. This, however, I did not ask with any expectation of life, for I was now in such a state of suffering that my only wish was to be allowed to lie down and die in peace. Nothing could exceed the humanity of Mr. Abbott, the inhabitant of Fleet Farm House, nor the compassionate attention of his sister, Miss Abbott, who not only afforded me immediate assistance, but continued for some days to attend me with such kindness and humanity as I shall always remember with the sincerest gratitude. The unfortunate sufferer who gives the preceding account was tended with great humanity by Mr. Brier, while a wound in her foot and the dangerous bruises she had received prevented her from quitting the shelter she first found under the roof of Mr. Abbott at Fleet. As soon as she was in a condition to be removed to Weymouth, Mr. Brier, a surgeon there, received her into his own house, where Mrs. Brier assisted in administering to her recovery such benevolent offices of consolation as her deplorable situation admitted. Meantime, the gentlemen of the South Battalion of the Gloucester Militia, who had done everything possible towards the preservation of those who were the victims of the tempest, now liberally contributed to alleviate the pecuniary distresses of the survivors. None seemed to have so forcible a claim on their pity as this forlorn and helpless stranger, and she alone, of 40 souls, except a single shipboy, survived the wreck of the Catharine. There perished 12 seamen, 2 soldiers' wives, 22 dragoons and 4 officers, Lieutenant Staines, Mr. Dodd of the hospital staff, Lieutenant Jenner, the representative of an ancient and respectable family in Gloucestershire, aged 31, and Cornet Burns, the son of an American PG 293 loyalist of considerable property, who was deprived of everything for his adherence to the British government. Having no dependence, but on the promises of government to indemnify those who had suffered on that account, he, after years of distress and difficulty, obtained a cornetcy in the 26th Regiment of Dragoons, then going to the West Indies, and was thus lost in his 24th year. This officer had intended embarking in another transport, and had actually sent his horse on board, when finding the Catharine more commodious, he gave her the preference, while the other put back to Spithead in safety. The mangled remains of Lieutenant Jenner were 2 days afterwards found on the beach, and interred with military honors. But the Catharine was not the only vessel which suffered in the tempest. Those who on shore had listened to it raging on the preceding evening could not avoid feeling the most lively alarm for the consequences, and early on the morning of the 18th of November, several pilots and other persons assembled on the promontory called the Lookout at Weymouth. Thence they too evidently discovered the distress and danger of many of the transports. Soon after, a lieutenant of the Navy, residing at Weymouth, applied to the major of a militia regiment for a guard to be sent to the Chisel Bank, as a large ship, supposed to be a frigate, was on shore. This was immediately granted, and the major himself marched along with a captain's guard. The violence of the wind was so great that the party could with difficulty reach the place of their destination. There they found a large merchantman, the Alice, laden with timber for government, on shore. Lieutenant Mason of the Navy and his brother, a midshipman, perished in her, and a number of men who would probably have been saved had they understood the signals from shore. The men of Portland who crowded down to the scene of desolation meant to express, by throwing small pebbles at them, that they should remain on board. To make them hear was impossible, because they foresaw the ship would drive high on the bank. Should that be the case, they might soon leave her without hazard, and accordingly those who continued on board were saved, though many of them were dreadfully bruised. Not far from the same place, the Golden Grove, another merchantman was stranded, and in her Dr. Stevens and Mr. Burrows of St. Kitts were lost. Lieutenant Colonel Ross, who was also there, escaped on shore. These 2 vessels PG 294 had struck against a part of the passage house, almost in the same spot where a French frigate, the Zenobia, had gone to pieces in 1763. But the scene of distress was infinitely greater about 4 miles to the westward, where, as already related, the Catharine was wrecked. Along with her, nearly opposite to the villages of Fleet and Chickerell, the Piedmont and Venus, 2 transports, and soon after the Thomas, a merchantman, shared the same fate. 138 soldiers of the 63D Regiment, under the command of Captain Barcroft, were on board the Piedmont, also Lieutenant Ash and Mr. Kelly, surgeon of the same regiment. Of all these, only Sergeant Richardson, 11 privates, and 4 seamen survived the catastrophe. All the rest perished. Captain Barcroft's life had passed in the service. While yet a very young man, he served in America during the war between England and her colonies, and being then taken prisoner, was severely treated. On commencement of the war which has so many years desolated Europe, he raised a company in his native country, and served with it on the continent during the campaign of 1794. Under a heavy fire of the enemy, he was one of the last men who retreated with it along a single plank, knee-deep in water, from the siege of Nijmegen. In a few months after the disastrous retreat on the continent, in the winter 1794, he was ordered to the West Indies, and in the outset of his voyage, perished in the tempest. Of the few who reached the shore from the Piedmont, there was scarce one who was not dreadfully bruised, and some had their limbs broken. An unfortunate veteran of the 63D, though his leg was shockingly fractured, had sufficient resolution to creep for shelter under a fishing boat, which lay inverted on the further side of the bank. There his groans were unheard, until a young gentleman, Mr. Smith, a passenger in the Thomas, who had himself been wrecked, and was now wandering along the shore, discovered him. In this ship, the Thomas, bound to Oporto, the master, Mr. Brown, his son, and all the crew, except the mate, 3 seamen and Mr. Smith, were lost. The last was on his way to Lisbon, but his preservation was chiefly in consequence of his remaining on board after all the rest had left the ship, or were washed away by the waves. She had then drifted high on the bank, when he leaped out of her and reached the ground. PG 295, though weak, and encumbered by his wet clothes, he gained the opposite side of the bank, but on gazing on the dreary beach around him, he considered himself cast away on an uninhabited coast. At length he observed a fishing boat, and approaching it, heard the groans of the unfortunate old soldier, whom he attempted to relieve. But alone he found himself unable to fulfill his intention, and it was a considerable time before he observed any means of assistance near. At last, perceiving a man at some distance, he hastened to him, eagerly inquiring whether a surgeon could be procured for a poor creature with a broken limb who lay under the boat. Probably the man showed little alacrity, for Mr. Smith found it necessary to purchase his good offices by a gift of half a guinea, which he imagined would induce him to seek what was so much required. But the man, pocketing the half-guinea with the greatest composure, said he was a king's officer, and must see what bales of goods were driven on shore. Then telling Mr. Smith there was a ferry about 4 miles off, by which he might get to Weymouth. The youth was thus disappointed of his humane design, and the soldier died in that deplorable condition before any other aid attained him. In the Thomas, the vessel to which Mr. Smith belonged, he witnessed scenes not less distressing. Mr. Brown, the master of the vessel, was carried away by an immense wave just as he was stripping off his clothes to endeavor to save himself. His son exclaiming, "Oh, my father, my poor father," instantly followed. The bodies of both were afterwards found and interred at Wyke. Of 96 persons on board the Venus, only Mr. John Darley of the hospital staff, Sergeant Major Hearn, 12 soldiers, 4 seamen and a boy were saved. Mr. Darley escaped by throwing himself from the wreck at a moment when it drifted high on the stones. He reached them without broken limbs, but overtaken by the furious sea, he was carried back, not so far, however, that he was incapable of regaining the ground. Notwithstanding the weight of his clothes and his exhausted state, he got to the top of the bank, but there the power of farther exertion failed, and he fell. While lying in this situation, trying to recover breath and strength, a great many people from the neighboring villages passed him. They had crossed the Fleet water in the hopes of sharing the plunder of the vessels, which the lower inhabitants of the coast are too much accustomed to consider their right. Mr. Darley seems to have been so far from meeting with PG 296 assistance from those who were plundering the dead, without thinking of the living, that although he saw many boats passing and repassing the fleet water, he found great difficulty in procuring a passage for himself and 2 or 3 fellow sufferers who had now joined him. But having passed it, he soon met with Mr. Briar, to whose active humanity all the sufferers were eminently indebted. Before the full extent of this dreadful calamity was known at Weymouth, the officers of the South Gloucester militia, with equal humanity, were devising how they might best succor the survivors and perform the last duties to the remains of those who had perished. On the morning of the 19th of November, one of them, accompanied by Mr. Briar of Weymouth, rode to the villages where those who had escaped from the various wrecks had found a temporary shelter. In a house at Chickerell, they found Sergeant Richardson and 11 privates of the 63D Regiment. 2 of the latter had fractured limbs, and almost all the rest either wounds or bruises. In other houses, the sufferers had been received and were as comfortably accommodated as circumstances would admit. The gentlemen then crossed the Fleet water to the beach, and there, whatever idea was previously formed of it, the horror of the scene infinitely surpassed expectation. No celebrated field of carnage ever presented, in proportion to its size, a more awful sight than the Chisel Bank now exhibited. For about 2 miles it was strewed with the dead bodies of men and animals, with pieces of wreck and piles of plundered goods, which groups of people were carrying away, regardless of the sight of drowned bodies that filled the new spectators with sorrow and amazement. On the mangled remains of the unfortunate victims, death appeared in all its hideous forms. Either the sea or the people who had first gone down to the shore had stripped the bodies of the clothes which the sufferers had wore at the fatal moment. The remnants of the military stock, the wristbands or color of a shirt or a piece of blue pantaloons were all the fragments left behind. The only means of distinguishing the officers was the different appearance of their hands from those of men accustomed to hard labor. But some were known by the description given of them by their friends or by persons who were in the vessels along with them. The remains of Captain Barcroft were recognized by the honorable scars he had received in the service of his country, and the friends and PG 297 relatives of him and several more had the satisfaction of learning that their bodies were rescued from the sea and interred with military honors. Early in the morning of the 20th of November, a lieutenant of the militia regiment, who had been appointed to superintend the melancholy office of interment, repaired to the scene of destruction. But from the necessary preliminaries of obtaining the authority of a magistrate to remove the bodies, not more than 25 were buried that day. The bodies of Captain Barcroft, Lieutenant Sutherland, Cornet Graydon, Lieutenant Kerr, and 2 women were then selected to be put into coffins. Next day, those of Lieutenant Jenner and Cornet Burns, being found, were distinguished in the like manner. The whole number of dead found on the beach amounted to 234, so that the duty of interment was so heavy and fatiguing that it was not until the 23rd that all the soldiers and sailors were deposited. Of these there were 208, and they were committed to the earth as decently as circumstances would admit, in graves dug on the Fleet side of the beach, beyond the reach of the sea, where a pile of stones was raised on each, to mark where they lay. 12 coffins were sent to receive the bodies of the women, but 9 only being found, the supernumerary ones were appointed to receive the remains of the officers. 2 wagons were next sent to the Fleet water to receive the coffins, in which the shrouded bodies of 17 officers and 9 women had been placed, and on the 24th were carried to the churchyard at Wyke, preceded by a captain, subaltern, and 50 men of the Gloucester militia, and attended by the young gentleman before mentioned, Mr. Smith, as chief mourner. The officers were interred in a large grave north of the church tower with military honors, and Lieutenant Kerr in a grave on the other side of the tower. The remains of the 9 women, which had been deposited in the church during the ceremony, were next committed to the earth. 2 monuments have been erected in commemoration of the unfortunate sufferers, the first bearing the following inscription: "To the memory of Captain Ambrose William Barcroft, Lieutenant Harry Ashe, and Mr. Kelly, surgeon of the 63D Regiment of Light Infantry, of Lieutenant Stephen Jenner, of the 6th West India Regiment, Lieutenant Staines of the 2D PG 298 West India Regiment, and 215 soldiers and seamen and 9 women, who perished by shipwreck on Portland Beach, opposite the villages of Langton, Fleet, and Chickerell, on Wednesday the 18th day of November, 1795. On the second monument is inscribed, "Sacred to the memory of Major John Charles Kerr, military commandant of hospitals in the Leeward Islands, and to that of his son, Lieutenant James Kerr, of the 40th Regiment of Foot, who both departed this life on the 18th of November 1795, the first aged 40 and the latter 14 years. The fate of both was truly deplorable, and is a melancholy example of the uncertainty of human affairs. They were embarked in the Venus transport and left Portsmouth the 15th of November with a fleet full of troops destined to the West Indies under the command of General Sir Ralph Abercrombie. A storm having arisen on the 17th, which lasted till the next day, many of the ships were lost, and the Venus wrecked on Portland Beach. The Major's body could not be found, although it is possible it may have been among the many others which were driven ashore and buried in this churchyard. His son's corpse was ascertained, and lies interred under this stone, which was raised by his brother John William Kerr, Esq. Wreck of the British ship Sydney. On a reef of rocks in the South Sea. The Sydney left Port Jackson on the coast of New Holland on the 12th of April, 1806, bound to Bengal. Intending to proceed through Dampier's Straits, her course was PG 299, directed as nearly as possible in the track of Captain Hogan of the Cornwallis, which, as laid down in the charts, appeared a safe and easy passage. But on the 20th of May, at 1A1000, we ran upon a most dangerous rock, or shoal, in 320 south latitude and 14650 east longitude, and as this reef is not noticed in any map or chart, it appears that we were its unfortunate discoverers. On Sunday, 25 fathoms of water were found over the taffrail, and 6 fathoms over the larboard gangway, only 9 feet on the starboard side, and 12 feet over the bows. One of the boats was immediately got out, with a bower anchor, but on sounding, at the distance of 10 fathoms from the ship, no ground could be found with 60 fathoms of line. When she struck, it must have been high water, for at that time there was no appearance of any reef or breaker, but as the water subsided, the shoal began to show itself, with a number of small black rocks. The ship had been striking very hard and began to yield forward. At 3A1000, there were 6 feet water in the hold, and increasing rapidly. At 5 the vessel was setting aft, and her top sides parting from the floor heads. Upon consultation with my officers, it was our unanimous opinion that the ship was gone beyond recovery, and that no exertions could avail for her safety. We therefore employed all hands in getting the boats ready to receive the crew, who were 108 in number. 8 bags of rice, 6 casks of water, and a small quantity of salted beef and pork were put into the longboat as provisions for the whole. The number of the people prevented us from taking a larger stock, as the 3 boats were barely sufficient to receive us all with safety. We remained with the Sydney until 5 P1000. On the 21st of May, when there were 3 feet of water on the orlop deck, therefore we now thought it full time to leave the ship to her fate and to seek our safety in the boats. Accordingly, I embarked in the longboat with Mr. Trounce, second officer, and 74 lascars. Mr. Robson and Mr. Halcutt with 16 lascars were in the cutter, and the jolly boat was allotted to 15 Dutch Malays and 1 Sepoy. Being desirous to ascertain the position of the reef, which could be done by making the Admiralty Islands, our course was shaped thither, steering north by east and half east. During the night it blew fresh, and the longboat having made much water, we were obliged to lighten her by throwing a great deal of lumber and 2 casks of water overboard. The PG 303 boats kept close in company, the longboat having the jolly boat in tow. Finding at daylight that the cutter sailed considerably better, I directed Mr. Robson that the jolly boat might be taken in tow by her. But the wind increasing as the morning advanced, and a heavy swell rising, the jolly boat, while in tow by the cutter, sunk at 10 o'clock, and all on board, to the number of 16, perished. It was lamentable to witness the fate of these unhappy men, and the more so as it was not in our power to render them the smallest assistance. The Admiralty Islands were seen at noon of the 22d, bearing NNE 3 or 4 leagues distant, and as we had run about 58 miles in the boats, upon a N by E half E course, the situation of the shoal where the Sydney struck was accurately ascertained, and will be found as above laid down. From the Admiralty Islands, we continued standing to the westward, and on the 25th made a small island, on which from its appearance I was induced to land in quest of a supply of water. Therefore Mr. Robson, myself, and 20 of our best hands, armed with heavy clubs, brought from New Caledonia, our firearms being rendered useless from exposure to the rain, landed through a high surf, to the utmost astonishment of the inhabitants. As far as might be judged, they had never before seen people of our complexion. The men were tall and well made, wearing their hair plaited and raised above the head. They had no resemblance to Malays or Kaffirs, and excepting their color, which was of a light copper, they had the form and features of Europeans. They were entirely naked. We also saw a number of women who were well formed and had mild and pleasing features. We were received on the beach by about 20 natives, who immediately supplied each of us with a coconut. We succeeded in making them understand that we wanted water, on which they made signs for us to accompany them to the interior of the island. On compliance, after walking about a mile, they conducted us into a thick jungle, and, as their number was quickly increasing, I judged it imprudent to proceed further. Thus returning to the beach, I was alarmed to find that 150 or more of the natives had assembled, armed with spears 8 or 10 feet long. One of them, an old man of venerable appearance, and who seemed to be their chief, approached and threw his spear at my feet, expressing, as I PG 301 understood, of his wish that we should part with our clubs in like manner. Perceiving at this time that a crowd of women had got hold of the sternfast of the cutter and were endeavoring to haul her on shore from the grapnel, we hastily tried to gain the boat. The natives followed us closely. Some of them pointed their spears at us as we retreated, and some were thrown, though happily without effect. And to us, they seemed to be very inexpert in the management of their weapons. On my getting into the water, 3 or 4 of the natives followed me, threatening to throw their spears, and when I was within reach of the boat, one of them made a thrust, which was prevented from taking effect by Mr. Robson, who warded off the weapon. When we had got into the boat and were putting off, they threw at least 200 spears, none of which struck, excepting one, which gave a severe wound to my cook, entering immediately above the jaw and passing through his mouth. Having escaped this perilous adventure, we pursued our course, and got as far as Dampier's Straits, in as favorable circumstances as our situation could well admit. But the Lascars, now being within reach of land, became impatient to be put on shore. It was in vain that I exhorted them to persevere. They would not listen to argument, and expressed their wish rather to meet with immediate death on shore than to be starved to death in the boats. Yielding to their importunity, I at length determined to land them on the northwest extremity of the island of Ceram, from whence they might travel to Amberna in 2 or 3 days. Being off that part of the island on the 9th of June, Mr. Robson volunteered to land a portion of the people in the cutter, to return to the longboat, and the cutter to be then given up to such further portion of the crew as chose to join the party first landed. Accordingly, he went ashore with the cutter, but to my great mortification, after waiting 2 days, there was no appearance of his return or of the cutter. We concluded that the people had been detained either by the Dutch or the natives. Yet, as the remaining part of the Lascars were desirous to be landed, we stood in with the longboat and put them on shore near the point where we supposed the cutter to have landed her people. Our number in the longboat were now reduced to 17, consisting of Mr. Trounce, Mr. Halcott, myself, and 14 Lascars and others. Our stock of provision was 2 bags of rice and 1 gang cask of water, with which we conceived PG 302 we might hold out until reaching Bencoolen, whither we determined to make the best of our way. The allowance to each man we fixed at 1 teacupful of rice and a pint of water daily, but we soon found it necessary to make a considerable reduction. Proceeding through the Straits of Bantam, we met in our course several Malay praus, none of which took notice of us excepting one, which gave chase for a day, and would have come up with us had we not got off under cover of a very dark night. Continuing onwards, we passed through the Strait of Sape, where we caught a large shark. Our spirits were much elated by this valuable prize, which we lost no time in getting on board, and having kindled a fire in the bottom of the boat, it was roasted with all expedition. Such was the keenness of our appetite, that although the shark must have weighed 150 or 160 pounds, not a vestige of it remained at the close of the day. But we were afflicted on the following day with the most violent complaint of the stomach and bowels, which reduced us exceedingly and left us languid and spiritless, insomuch that we now despaired of safety. On the 2nd of July I lost an old and faithful servant, who died from want of sustenance, and on the 4th we made Java Head, at the same time catching 2 large boobies, which afforded all hands a most precious and refreshing meal. At midnight of the 9th, we came to off Pulau Penang on the west coast of Sumatra, but at daylight, when endeavoring to weigh our anchor and run close inshore, we were so much exhausted that our united strength proved insufficient to get it up. On a signal of distress being made, a sampan with 2 Malays came off, and as I was the only person in the longboat who had sufficient strength to move, I accompanied them on shore. However, I found myself so weak on landing that I fell to the ground, and it was necessary to carry me to an adjacent house. Such refreshments as could be procured were immediately sent off to the longboat, and we recruited so rapidly that in 2 days we found ourselves in a condition to proceed on our voyage. Having weighed anchor on the 12th of July, we set sail, and on the 19th arrived off the island of Bencoolen. Here I met with an old friend, Captain Chauvet of the Perseverance, whose kindness and humanity I shall ever remember and gratefully acknowledge. On the day subsequent to my arrival, I waited on Mr. Parr the resident, from whom I received every attention. PG 303 leaving Bencoolen on the 17th of August, in the Perseverance, I arrived at Penang on the 27th, where I was agreeably surprised to meet my late chief mate Mr. Robson, who, along with the Lascars, had landed at Ceram. They reached Ambona in safety, where they were received by the Dutch governor, Mr. Cranstoun, with a humanity and benevolence that reflect honor on his character. He supplied them with whatever their wants required. Mr. Robson was accommodated at his own table, and on leaving Ambona, he furnished him money for himself and his people, for the amount of which he refused to take any receipt or acknowledgement. He also gave Mr. Robson letters to the Governor-General of Batavia, recommending him to his kind offices. Such honorable conduct from the governor of a foreign country, and with which we were at war, cannot be too widely promulgated. From Ambona, Mr. Robson embarked in the Pallas a Dutch frigate, for Batavia, which on the passage thither was captured by His Majesty's ships Greyhound and Harriet, and brought to Prince of Wales's Island. From Penang, I sailed to Bengal with the Paruna, Captain Dennison, and arrived safely in Calcutta in the beginning of May, 1806. Loss of the Duke William transport. The Duke William transport, commanded by Captain Nichols, was fitted out by him with all possible expedition in the year 1758, and lay at Spithead to receive orders. At length he proceeded to Cork, under convoy of the York man-of-war to take in soldiers for America, but just on approaching the Irish coast, a thick fog came on whereby he lost sight of the ship, and as it began to blow hard that night and the PG 304 next day, he was obliged to bear away for Waterford. When off Credon Head, guns were fired for a pilot. None, however, came off, and Captain Nichols, being unacquainted with the harbour, brought the ship up, though the sea ran very high. A pilot at last came on board, but the transport broke from her anchor, and on getting under sail, it was almost dark. After running along for some time under the foretopsail, triple-reefed, and scarce in sight of land, Captain Nichols cast anchor, and next morning, to his great surprise, found high rocks so close astern that he durst not veer away a cable. The sheet anchor had been let go in the night, and was the chief means of preservation. The yards and topmasts were now got down, a signal of distress hoisted, and many guns fired. A boat then came from the windward, and a man in her said, if Captain Nichols would give him £50, he would come on board, which being promised, he ascended the stern ladder. But when he found the ship so near the rocks, he declared that he would not remain on board for all the ship was worth. However, Captain Nichols told him that having come off as a pilot acquainted with the harbour, he should stay, and called to the people in the boat to hoist their sails, as he was going to cut her adrift, which he did accordingly. Meantime, the pilot was in the greatest confusion, but the captain said it was in vain to complain, and if by cutting or slipping the cables he could carry the ship to a place of safety, he was ready to do it. The pilot replied that he could neither take charge of her nor venture to carry her in, for he apprehended the ship would be on shore and dashed to pieces against the rocks before she would veer. And if she did veer, that a large French East Indiaman had been lost upon the bar, which made the channel very narrow, and he did not know the marks, so as to carry her clear of the wreck. The ship now rode very hard, and it being Sunday, a great many people were ready on shore to plunder her should she strike. Of this Captain Nichols entertained many apprehensions at low water, as she pitched so much. But fortunately, as the weather became more moderate, 2 English frigates which lay in the harbour sent their boats to his assistance, and the custom-house smack arriving, he escaped, though very narrowly, from the threatened danger. The Duke William soon afterwards proceeded to Cork to receive soldiers, and sailed from thence with a fleet of transports to Halifax, where they arrived safe and went to besiege Louisbourg. After landing the troops, the transports, and PG 305, some of the men of war, went into Gabarus Bay, where the admiral allowed the captains of the former to land their men, being sickly, on a small peninsula, which they engaged to defend from the enemy. 400 or 500 people therefore immediately set to work, and cut a ditch, 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, quite across the peninsula, as a protection against the Indians. They planted cannon, and also placed several swivels on the stumps of trees cut down for the purpose. Huts were next erected, gardens made, and the whole ground cleared and converted into pleasant arbors, from selecting portions of the shrubs and trees. Here the captains of the transports remained some time, during which the sick recovered surprisingly, and cures were operated by a remarkable expedient called a ground sweat. This was digging a hole in the ground, and being put into it naked, the earth was thrown over the patient up to the chin for a few minutes. At first the earth felt cold, but it quickly brought on a gentle perspiration, which cured the disorder. No one person died who underwent such treatment. On the reduction of Louisbourg, the island of St. John, in the entrance of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, capitulated, and the inhabitants were to be sent to France in the English transports. They therefore left the peninsula, which the people had entrenched, and after much bad weather, in which the Duke William parted her cable, and after a tedious passage arrived at St. John's, but not without the whole fleet being in danger of shipwreck. A party of soldiers brought the inhabitants down the country to the different transports, and the Duke William, being the largest, the missionary priest, who was the principal man there, was ordered to go with Captain Nichols. On his arrival, he requested permission for the other people who wished it to come on board to be married, and a great many marriages followed, from an idea prevailing that all the single men would be made soldiers. 9 transports sailed in company, Captain Wilson with Lord Rollo and some soldiers, and Captain Moore also with soldiers, under convoy of the hind sloop of war. The rest, being cartels, had no occasion for convoy. Captain Moore's vessel was lost going through the Gut of Canso, by striking on a sunken rock, whence the soldiers whom she carried were put on board Captain Wilson's ship bound to Louisbourg. Captain Moore, his son, mate, and carpenter took a passage in the Duke William. Contrary winds obliged the fleet to lie in the Gut of Canso, PG 306, where the French prisoners were permitted to go ashore frequently, and remain there all night, making fires in a wood to keep themselves warm, and some of them obtained muskets from Captain Nichols for shooting game, as they were not afraid of meeting with the Indians. About 3 hours after departing, one of them came running back, and begged, for God's sake, that the captain would immediately return on board with his people, as they had met with a party of Indians who were coming down to scalp them. Captain Nichols, with the other masters and sailors, hastily went off, and had scarce got on board when the Indians actually reached the place that they had left. Thus they had a very narrow escape of being murdered and scalped, had not the French been faithful and Providence interposed. The fleet, in gaining the Gut of Canso, had been assailed by dangers. During a fine night, some of the transports worked within the Gut, but Captain Nichols and Captain Johnson of the Parnassus cast anchor without it. In the night a hard gale arose, and increased so much that the latter let go 3 anchors, yet the ship drove ashore and was lost. Another ship, the Narcissus, also parted from her anchors and was obliged to run ashore, and most of the rest suffered damage. When the weather became somewhat moderate, Captain Nichols found that all the French prisoners on board the Parnassius had gained the land and had made themselves large fires in the woods on account of the cold, showery weather which prevailed. And on joining them there, he told them, to their great joy, that he would send boats to carry them off. This he did next morning, and finding it impossible to save the hull of the Parnassius, though another ship was got off shore, everything worth saving was taken out of her, and in particular one of the pumps, which was carried on board the Duke William to serve in case of emergency. On the 25th of November 1758, Captain Nichols sailed from the Bay of Canso, leading other 6 transports, with a strong breeze at northwest. All the captains agreed to make the best of their way to France, and not to go to Louisbourg, as it was a bad time of the year to beat on that coast, and then took leave of the agent who was bound thither. The 3rd day after being at sea, a storm blew in the night. Being dark with thick weather and sleet, the Duke William parted company with 3 of the ships, and the storm still continuing, in a day or 2 parted with the rest. Nevertheless, PG 307, the ship remained in good condition, and though the sea was mountains high, she went over it like a bird, and made no water. On the 10th of December, Captain Nichols saw a sail, which proved to be one of the transports, the Violet, Captain Suggett. On coming up, he asked how all were on board, to which Captain Suggett replied, in a terrible situation. He had a great deal of water in the ship, her pumps were choked, and he was much afraid that she would sink before morning. Captain Nichols begged him to keep up his spirits, and said that, if possible, he would stay by him and spare him the pump he had got out of the Parnassius. He also told him that, as the gale had continued so long, he hoped that it would moderate after 12 o'clock. Unfortunately, however, it rather increased, and on changing the watch at 12, he found that he went fast ahead of the Violet, whence, if he did not shorten sail, he would be out of sight of her before morning. Captain Nichols then consulted with Captain Moore and the mate on what was most proper to be done, and all were unanimous that the only means of saving the people in the Violet was to keep company with her until the weather should moderate, and that the main topsail should be taken in. Therefore, the main topsail of the Duke William was taken in, and 3 pumps got out to be ready in case of necessity. The spare pump was forced down an after hatchway and shipped in an empty butt, of which the French had brought several on board to wash in. Everything was preparing, both for pumping and bailing, should it be required, and the people of the transport thought themselves secure against all hazards. They now believed that the Violet gained on them, and were glad to see her quite plain about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. On changing the watch, they found the ship still tight and going very well, the carpenter assuring Captain Nichols that there was no water to strike a pump. He, fatigued with walking the deck so long, designed going below to smoke a pipe of tobacco to beguile time, and desired the mate to acquaint him immediately should any alteration take place. The board next the lower part of the pump had been driven to see how much water was in the well, and every half hour, when the ball was struck, the carpenter went down. As he had hitherto found no water, Captain Nichols felt quite comfortable in his situation in particular, and on going below, ordered a little Negro boy, whom he had as an apprentice, to get him a pipe of tobacco. PG 308 soon after filling and lighting his pipe, he was thrown from his chair, while sitting in his stateroom, by a blow that the ship received from a terrible sea, on which he dispatched the boy to ask Mr. Fox, the mate, whether anything was washed over. Mr. Fox returned answer that all was safe, and he saw the Violet coming up fast. Captain Nichols, then being greatly fatigued, thought he would endeavor to procure refreshment from a little sleep, and without undressing, threw himself on the side of his bed. But before his eyes were closed, Mr. Fox came to inform him that the carpenter had found the water above the kelson, and that the ship had certainly sprung a leak. He immediately rose and took the carpenter down to the hold along with him, when, to his infinite surprise, he heard the water roaring in dreadfully. On further examination, he found that a butt had started, and the more they endeavored to press anything into it, the more the plank forsook the timber. Therefore they went on deck, to encourage the people at the pumps, after making a mark with chalk to ascertain how the water gained upon them. Captain Nichols, considering the case desperate, went to all the Frenchmen's cabins, begging them to rise. He said that, although their lives were not in danger, their assistance was desired at the pumps, where it would be of the greatest service. They got up accordingly and cheerfully lent their aid. By this time it was daylight, when, to the great surprise and concern of the Duke William's people, they saw the Violet on her broadside at a little distance. The foreyard broke in the slings, the foretopsail set, and her crew endeavoring to free her of the mizzen-mast. Probably she had just then broached to by the foreyard giving way. A violent squall came on, which lasted for 10 minutes, and when it cleared up, they discovered that the unfortunate ship had gone to the bottom with nearly 400 souls. The stoutest was appalled by the event, especially as their own fate seemed to be approaching. All the tubs above mentioned were prepared and gangways made. The Frenchmen assisted, and also the women, who behaved with uncommon resolution. The hatches were then opened, and as the water flowed fast into the hold, the tubs being filled, were hauled up and emptied on the upper deck, which, with 3 pumps constantly at work and bailing out of the gun-room scuttle, discharged a great quantity of water. A seam would have done them little injury, but a butt's end was more than they could manage, though every method that PG 309 could be deemed serviceable was tried. The spritsail was quilted with oakum and flax, and one of the top-gallant sails was prepared in the same manner to see whether anything would sink into the leak, but all in vain. In this dismal condition, the transport continued 3 days. Notwithstanding all the exertions of the people, she was full of water, and they expected her to sink every minute. They had already got the whole liquor and provisions, the hold now being full, and the ship swimming only by the decks from the buoyancy of empty casks below. The people, about 6 o'clock on the 4th morning, came to Captain Nichols, declaring that they had done all that lay in their power, that the ship was full of water, and that it was in vain to pump any more. Captain Nichols acknowledged the truth of what they said. He told them that he could not desire them to do more, that they had behaved like brave men, and must now trust in Providence alone, as there was no expedient left for saving their lives. He then acquainted the priest with their situation, that every method for saving the ship and the lives of the people had been adopted, but that he expected the decks to blow up every moment. The priest was stunned by the intelligence, but answered that he would immediately go and give his people absolution for dying, which he did, says Captain Nichols, and I think a more melancholy scene cannot be supposed than so many people, hearty, strong, and in health, looking at each other with tears in their eyes, bewailing their unhappy condition. No fancy can picture the seeming distraction of the poor unhappy children clinging to their mothers, and the wives hanging over their husbands, lamenting their miserable fate. Shocking situation, words cannot describe it. Captain Nichols then called the men down the main hatchway, along with him, to examine the leak in the hold. He told them they must be content with their fate, and as they were certain they had done their duty, they should submit to Providence with pious resignation. He walked on deck with Captain Moore, desiring him to devise any expedient to save them from perishing. With tears in his eyes, Captain Moore assured him that he knew of none, as all that could be thought of had been used. Providence, in Captain Nichols' belief, induced him to propose attempting to hoist out the boats, so that if a ship should appear, their lives might be saved, as the gale was more moderate. But to this proposal, Captain Moore said it would be impossible, as everybody would PG 310 endeavor to get into them. Captain Nichols, however, was of a different opinion, observing that, under their severe trial, the sailors had behaved with uncommon resolution, and were very obedient to his commands. He flattered himself that they would all continue so, and all were sensible that in case the ship broached to, the masts must be cut away to prevent her from oversetting, when it would be beyond their power to hoist out the boats. He then called the mates, carpenters, and men, and proposed to get out the boats, at the same time acquainting them that it was to save every soul on board if possible, and declaring that if any person should be so rash as to insist on going into them, besides those he should think proper, that they should immediately be scuttled. But all solemnly maintained that his commands should be as implicitly obeyed as if the ship had been in her former good condition, thus setting an example which is rarely to be found. Captain Nichols then went to acquaint the chief prisoner on board with what was about to be attempted. He was 110 years old, the father of the whole island of St. John S., and had a number of children, grandchildren, and other relations in the ship. His observation was that he was convinced Captain Nichols would not do a bad action, for by experience he had found how much care he had taken of him and his friends, and likewise what endeavors had been used to save the ship and their lives. Therefore they were ready to assist in anything he should propose. Captain Nichols assured him that he would not forsake them, but run an equal chance. This he thought the only means of saving their lives, should it please Providence to send any ship to their assistance, and it was their duty to use all means given to them. He next asked Mr. Fox and the carpenter whether they were willing to venture in the longboat, to which they boldly answered in the affirmative, as whether they perished on the spot or a mile or two farther off was a matter of very little consequence, and as there was no prospect but death in remaining, they would willingly make the attempt. Captain Moore, the carpenter and mate, also willingly agreed to his proposal to go in the cutter. The cutter was accordingly got over the side, and the ship lying pretty quiet, they cut the tackles, when she dropped very well into the water, and the penter brought her up. They next went to work with the longboat, and daylight having fairly come in, gave them great spirits, as they flattered PG 311 themselves, should it please God Almighty to send a ship, it would be in their power to save all their lives, the weather being now much more moderate than before. The mate and carpenter having cut the runners, the longboat fell into the water as well as the cutter had done, and a proper penter being made fast, she brought up properly. People were stationed at the main and foretopmast heads to look out for a sail, when to the unspeakable joy of all on board, the man at the main topmast cried out that he saw two ships right astern making after the transport. Captain Nichols having acquainted the priest and the old gentleman with the good news, the latter took him in his aged arms and wept for joy. The captain ordered the ensign to be hoisted to the main topmast shrouds and the guns to be got all clear for firing. The weather was very hazy, and the ships not far distant when first discovered. Whenever the transport hoisted her signal of distress, they showed English colors and seemed to be West Indiamen, of about 300 or 400 tons. Captain Nichols continued loading and firing as fast as possible when he perceived the two ships speak with each other, and setting their foresail and topsails, they hauled their wind and stood off. Supposing that the size of his ship, and her having so many men on board, added to its being the time of war, might occasion distrust, he ordered the mainmast to be cut away to undeceive them. People had been placed in the shrouds to cut away in case of necessity, but one of the shrouds not being properly cut, checked the mainmast and made it fall right across the boats. On this Captain Nichols hastily ran aft and cut the penters of both the boats, otherwise they would have been staved to pieces and sunk immediately. A dismal thing it was to cut away what could be the only means of saving the people's lives, and at the same time see the ships so basely leave them. No words can picture their distress. Driven from the greatest joy to the utmost despair, death now appeared more dreadful. They had only the foresail hanging in the brails, and the braces of both penters being rendered useless by the fall of the mainmast, and the yard flying backward and forward by the rolling of the ship, rendered them apprehensive that she would instantly overset. The ship ran from the boats until they remained just in sight, and finding they made no endeavor to join her, though each was provided with oars, foremast, and foresail, Captain Nichols consulted with the boatswain on what was most proper to be done in their dangerous condition. He said PG 312 that he thought they should bring the ship to at all events, though he acknowledged it a dreadful alternative to hazard her oversetting. The boatswain agreed that it was extremely dangerous, as the vessel steered very well. However, Captain Nichols, finding that the men in the boat did not attempt to join him, called the people aft and told them his resolution. They said it was desperate, and so was their condition, but they were ready to do whatever he thought best. But Captain Moore seemed to be quite against it. Captain Nichols then acquainted the old gentleman, the priest, and the rest of the people, who were pleased to say, let the consequence be what it might, they should be satisfied. He had acted for the best, and all were resigned to the consequences. He therefore ordered men to every fore-shroud, and one with an axe to the foremast to cut it away, should that measure become indispensable. But his own situation he declares to have been in the meantime dreadful, in reflecting that this alternative, though in his judgment right, might be the means of sending nearly 400 souls to eternity. However, the Almighty endowed him with resolution to persevere, and he gave orders to bring the ship to. In hauling out the mizzen, which had been greatly chafed, it split. A new staysail was then bent to bring the ship to, which had the desired effect after a considerable time, for a heavy sea striking on the starboard quarter excited an apprehension that it would be necessary to cut away the mast. When the men in the yawl saw the ship lying to for them, they got up their foremast and ran on board, holding the sheets in their hands on account of the wind. And as soon as they arrived, some men were sent to row to the assistance of the longboat. They soon joined her, got her foremast up, set the sail, as the cutter likewise did, and to the great joy of all, reached the ship in safety. Just as the boats came up, the people at the masthead exclaimed, "A sail, a sail!" And the captain thought it better to let the ship lie, as by seeing the mainmast gone, it might be known that she was in distress. The weather was hazy, and he could see to no great distance, but the strange vessel was soon near enough to perceive and hear his guns. She had scarce hoisted her colours, which were Danish, when her main-topsail sheet gave way, on observing which, Captain Nichols, conceiving her main-topsail was to be clewed up, and she would come to his assistance, immediately imparted the good news to the priest and the rest. Poor deluded people, they hugged him in their arms, calling him their friend and PG 313 preserver. But alas, it was short-lived joy, for as soon as the Dane had knotted or spliced her topsail sheet, she stood away and left them. What pen is able, says Captain Nichols, to describe the despair that reigned in the ship? The poor unhappy people, wringing their hands, cried out that God had forsaken them. It was now about 3 in the afternoon. Captain Nichols wore the ship, which she bore very well, and steered tolerably before the wind. Towards half an hour afterwards, the old gentleman came to him in tears, and taking him in his arms, said he came by desire of the whole people to request that he and his men would endeavor to save their lives in the boats, and as these were insufficient to carry more, they would by no means be accessory to their destruction. They were well convinced by their whole conduct that they had done everything in their power for their preservation, but that God Almighty had ordained them to perish, though they trusted he and his men would get safe on shore. Such gratitude for only doing a duty in endeavoring to save the lives of the prisoners, as well as their own, astonished Captain Nichols. He replied that there was no hopes of life, and as all had embarked in the same unhappy voyage, they should all take the same chance. He thought that they ought to share the same fate. The old gentleman said that should not be, and if he did not acquaint his people with the offer, he should have their lives to answer for. Accordingly, the captain mentioned it to Captain Moore and the people. They said that they would with the greatest satisfaction remain, could anything be devised for the preservation of the others, but that being impossible, they would not refuse to comply with their request. The people then, thanking them for their great kindness, with tears in the eyes of all, hastened down the stern ladder. As the boats ranged up by the sea under the ship's counter, those that went last cast themselves down and were caught by the men in the boat. Captain Nichols told them he trusted to their honor that they would not leave him, as he was determined not to quit the ship until it was dark, in hopes that Providence would yet send something to their aid. The whole assured him that he should not be deserted. He had a little Norse boy on board, whom no entreaties could persuade to enter the boat until he himself had done so. But as it was growing dark, he insisted on the boy's going, saying he would immediately follow him. The boy PG 314 obeyed and got on the stern ladder, when a Frenchman whom the dread of death induced to quit his wife and children unperceived, made over the taffrail and trod on the Norse boy's fingers. The boy screamed aloud, which led Captain Nichols to believe that some person was in danger, and on repairing to the place, followed by the old gentleman, they found to their great surprise that the man, who had a wife and children on board, was attempting to get away and save himself. The old gentleman, calling him by his name, said he was sorry to find him base enough to desert his family. He seemed ashamed of what he had done and returned over the taffrail. By this time, the people of the boat begged the captain to come, as the blows she received from below the ship's counter were like to sink her. Captain Nichols, seeing the priest stretching his arms over the rails in great emotion, and apparently under strong apprehensions of death, asked him whether he was willing to take his chance in the boat. He replied in the affirmative if there was room, and on learning that there was, he immediately went and gave the people his benediction, and after saluting the old gentleman, tucked up his conical robes and forsook the vessel. Captain Nichols saluted him likewise, and several others, and then left them praying for his safety. When he entered the boat, he bid the sailors cast her adrift. It was very dark, and they had neither moon nor stars to direct them. "What a terrible situation," he exclaims. "We were 27 in the longboat, and 9 in the cutter, without victuals or drink." Uncertain of their distance from the English coast, they agreed to keep as close as possible to the ship. It began to blow very fresh, with sleet and snow. The people were fatigued to the uttermost, from working so long at the pumps, and after sitting in the wet and cold, they began to wish that they had stayed in the ship and perished, as now they might die a lingering death. Either alternative was awful. Destitute of provision, it was most probable that one must be sacrificed by lot to keep the others alive, and their dismal situation, in arousing the most horrible anticipations, made them forebode the worst. The boats now began to make water, yet the men refused to bail them. They were in a state of such extreme weariness, and not having slept for 4 nights, became regardless of their fate. Captain Nichols, nevertheless, prevailed on them to free the longboat of water. PG 315 having a brisk gale, they soon ran a long way from their unfortunate ship, when to their great distress, it fell quite calm at 10 in the morning. This threw the people in despair, their courage began to fail, and as they could not expect to live so long as to make the land, death seemed again staring them in the face. Some time after this unlucky party forsook the ship, 4 of the French prisoners let a small jolly boat, which was still remaining, overboard, with 2 small paddles, and swam to her, and just as they left the vessel, her decks blew up with a report like a gun. She sunk in the ocean, and 360 souls perished with her. Captain Nichols, at length observing the water colored, asked whether they had any twine, on which one of them gave him a bowl from his pocket. They knocked the bolts off the knees of the longboat, wherewith to make a deep-sea lead, and sounding with it, were rejoiced to find only 45 fathom water. But the people complaining greatly of hunger and thirst, Captain Nichols said he was sorry to acquaint them that he had nothing for them to eat or drink, yet encouraged them to bear up with manly resolution, as by their soundings they were near Scilly, and he doubted not, if it cleared, that they should see the land. The little Norse boy, who had always kept close by the captain, now said that he had got some bread, and on taking it from the bosom of his shirt, it proved to be like baker's dough. However, it was bread, and very acceptable. The whole might amount to about 4 pounds, and Captain Nichols, having put it into his hat, distributed it equally, calling for those in the yawl to receive their share. But instead of being a relief, it increased their troubles, for being wet and clammy, it hung to the roof of their mouths, having nothing to wash it down. Mr. Fox had some allspice also, which was of little service. Having been cut in pieces, the people forced it down their throats, which created some saliva, and by that means it was swallowed. About noon, a light air sprung up at southwest. Each boat had a foremast, foresail, and oars, but owing to the boats having been foul of the mainmast, all the oars were washed away except 2 from each. Captain Nichols was told, in answer to his inquiries concerning a noise among the crew, that 2 seamen were disputing about a couple of blankets, which one of them had brought from the ship. These blankets he ordered to be thrown overboard, rather than they PG 316 should be suffered to breed any quarrel, as in their unhappy condition it was no time to have disputes. But on reflection, having desired that they should be brought to him, he thought of converting them to use, by forming each into a mainsail. Therefore, 1 oar was erected for a mainmast, and the other broke to the breadth of the blankets for a yard. The people in the cutter, observing what was done in the longboat, converted a hammock which they had on board into a mainsail. At 4 in the afternoon it cleared up, when the adventurers descried a brig about 2 miles distant, to which Captain Nichols ordered the cutter to give chase, as it being lighter than the longboat, would sooner get up and let her know their distress. But the brig, seeing the boats after their course, directly stood from them, owing, as Captain Nichols supposed, to their odd appearance. For war then prevailing, they were probably taken for the French luxel boats that used to frequent the lands off Scilly. The cutter, however, gained fast on the brig, when having got about halfway, a very thick fog came on, and neither the brig nor the cutter were again seen from the longboat. Night fell, and the weather still continuing very foggy, the people, almost dead for want of sleep, reposed themselves, sitting halfway in water, it being impossible for so many to find seats. Their captain, anxious for their lives and his own, strove to keep his eyes open, though it was the 5th night that he had taken no rest. About 11 o'clock, when everyone was asleep but the helmsman and himself, he thought that he saw land. Yet he was determined not to call out land until he should be sure that it was so. He squeezed his eyelids together to let the water run out of his eyes, as he found them very 1499. Again he thought he saw land very plain, and was convinced that he could not be deceived. By this time the man at the helm had dropped asleep, and he took the tiller himself. Some space longer elapsed before he would disturb anybody, but at last he awoke Captain Moore, telling him he thought he saw land. Captain Moore only answered that they should never see land again. Captain Nichols then awoke Mr. Fox, who had obtained a sound sleep, and seemed quite refreshed. He immediately cried out that they were near land and close in with the breakers. Lucky it was that he had been awakened, otherwise Captain Nichols, from being absolutely unacquainted with them, was satisfied that all on board would have perished. PG 317, at the word land everyone awoke, and with some difficulty the boat cleared the rocks. At first the precise part of the English coast could not be ascertained, but as it cleared more and more every moment, Captain Nichols, on looking under the lee leech of the blanket mainsail, discerned St. Michael's Mount in Mounts Bay. The boat would not fetch the land near Penzance, and as she had no oars, it was determined to avoid steering round the Lizard and so for Falmouth, but to run her boldly on shore, whatever place she might chance to make. It was a fine night, and after getting round the point, the people found the water very smooth. Keeping the boat close to the wind, they made between Penzance and the point. Their joy at finding themselves in so favorable a situation is not to be conceived. It gave them new life and strength. Those who were forward exclaimed that there were 2 rocks ahead. Captain Nichols hastened before, and his sight having come well to him, he carried the boat between them without touching ground, and in a little time ran her ashore on a sandy beach. The seamen leapt into the water, and carried the priest and the captain ashore. The former, kneeling down, made a short prayer, and then coming to embrace Captain Nichols, called him his preserver, and said that he had rescued him from death. Leaving the boat as she lay, all made the best of their way to the town of Penzance. But some of the people, with sleeping wet, were so much benumbed that they could scarce get along, and Captain Nichols himself declares that from the time of the ship's springing a leak until that hour he had had no sleep and very little sustenance. However, having fallen in with a run of fresh water on the road to Penzance, all were revived by drinking heartily of it. The party, reaching the town about 3 in the morning, made up to a tavern where they saw a light, and as it had been a market day, the mistress of the house was still up. When Captain Nichols entered by the door, which was not locked, she was undressing, with her back to a fire, the light he had seen, and being greatly alarmed, screamed, "Murder, thieves!" The appearance of 27 people at such an unseasonable hour was certainly enough to create apprehension, especially from the condition which they were in. But the captain, endeavoring to pacify her, requested she would call PG 318 her husband or servants, as they were shipwrecked men, and give them some refreshment. The landlord soon came, and having provided provisions, the people got into as many beds as were there, while the rest of them slept on the floor by the side of the fire. Next morning, the captain, accompanied by the priest, went to the mayor of the town to make a protest before a notary, and to see if he could get credit, as both he and the people were in want of every necessary, and it was many miles to London. The mayor received him kindly, but told him that he was no merchant, and that he never supplied people in the condition that he was in with money, but if he pleased, he would send a servant with him to Mr. Charles Langford, a merchant who generally supplied the masters of vessels in distress with necessaries. Mr. Langford received Captain Nichols politely, but in answer to his request for credit, said that he had made a resolution not to supply with credit any man to whom he was an entire stranger, as he had been deceived by one very lately, and though his might have been a large ship, to judge by the boat which was come on shore, he, the captain, might not be concerned in her, and as he should want a great deal of money, he should beg to be excused. Captain Nichols answered that he was partly owner of the ship, and Mr. Langford might be certain that his bills were duly honored. However, he said he could not do it. Captain Nichols, grievously disappointed, returned to the inn, where several tradesmen had arrived to furnish the people with clothes and other necessaries. He told the latter he could get no credit, but that they must travel on as far as Exeter, where he was sure of obtaining relief, which was very unwelcome news, as most of the people wanted shoes. The captain next requested the landlord of the inn to get them some breakfast, but he desired to be excused and wished to know if the captain could get no credit, how he was to be paid. Captain Nichols was quite at a loss how to act. Being denied both credit and victuals, he thought that he would pawn or sell his ring, watch, buckles, and buttons. Accordingly, returning to Mr. Langford, he begged he would give him what he thought proper for these things. He took the ring from his finger, the watch from his pocket, and with tears in his eyes was going to take the buckles from his shoes, when Mr. Langford prevented him, saying he should have credit for as much as he pleased, for he believed him to be an honest man, and saw that his people's distress touched him more, if possible, PG 319, than his own misfortunes. He then gave what money the captain required. During these transactions, the second mate and the 8 men belonging to the cutter arrived. They said it was so very thick they could not come up with the brig which they were in pursuit of, and that, seeing the land's end when it cleared, they got ashore. As nobody would buy the cutter, they had left her, and had inquired the way to Penzance, where, being in great distress, they rejoiced to meet their comrades. Captain Nichols went to the inn and discharged what was owing. On account of the unkindness which he had experienced, he resolved to stay no longer, and repaired to another house to breakfast. He next procured the necessaries wanted by his people, and then went with his mates to make a protest. But not choosing that the declaration should proceed from his own mouth, Mr. Langford's son acted as interpreter to the French priest, who was to make it. The priest accordingly made a strong and full affidavit that Captain Nichols and his people had tried every means to keep the ship above water, that they had used the French all the time they were on board, with the greatest kindness and humanity, and that Captain Nichols had parted from them with the greatest reluctance, and even at their own desire went into the boat, after all hopes of life were gone. Having remained another day at Penzance to refresh the people, and getting credit for what was wanted, Captain Nichols, Captain Moore, and the officers set out in a carriage for Exeter, while the people, who had got a pass from the mayor, walked on foot. At Redruth, a town in Cornwall, there were many French officers on parole, as also an English commissary. Captain Nichols accompanied the priest to the latter in quest of a pass to Falmouth, that he might embark in the first cartel for France, and here took leave of him. Captain Nichols, having reached London, was under the necessity of being examined at the Admiralty and Navy Office about the loss of the people and the ship, she being a transport in the service of government. The lords of the Admiralty and commissioners of the Navy told him that he might say more than any man living, as he had brought ashore with him the first man of France, a priest, of course an enemy to both their religion and country. If his behavior had not been good, he would not have attempted it, but at the same time, they acknowledged that without such a proof, they PG 320 could not have believed, but finding all hopes gone, he and his people got away by some stratagem. They would pay, they said, to the hour that the ship foundered, and were very sorry that they could do no more. The 4 Frenchmen, above mentioned, who had left the transport in the little boat, subsequent to the departure of Captain Nichols and his men, got into Falmouth within 2 days. So ended this dreadful and unfortunate voyage, with the loss of a fine ship and 360 souls. Commodore Barney. No old Triton who has passed his calms under the bows of the longboat could say of Joshua Barney that he came into a master's berth through the cabin windows. He began at the rudiments, and well he understood the science. All his predilections were for the sea. Having deserted the counting-room, young Barney, at the age of 12, was placed for nautical instruction in a pilot boat at Baltimore, till he was apprenticed to his brother-in-law. At the age of 14, he was appointed second mate, with the approbation of the owners, and before he was 16, he was called upon to take charge of his ship at sea in which the master had died. This was on a voyage to Nice. The ship was in such a state that it was barely possible to make Gibraltar, where for necessary repairs he pledged her for £700, to be repaid by the consignee at Nice, who however declined, and called in the aid of the governor to compel Barney to deliver the cargo, which he had refused to do. He was imprisoned, but set at large on some intimation that he would do as desired. But when he came on board, he struck his flag and removed his crew, choosing to consider his vessel as captured. He then set out for Milan to solicit the aid of the British ambassador there, in which he succeeded so well that the PG 321 authorities of Nice met him on his return to apologize for their conduct. The assignee paid the bond, and Barney sailed for Alicante, where his vessel was detained for the use of the Great Armada, then fitting out against Algiers, the fate of which was a total and shameful defeat. On his return home, his employer was so well satisfied with his conduct that he became his firm friend ever after. He soon offered himself as second in command on board the sloop Hornet, of 10 guns, one of 2 vessels then preparing for a cruise under Commodore Hopkins, for this was in the early part of the Revolution. The sloop fell in with a British tender, which she might have captured, but for the timidity of the American captain. The tender, mistaking her enemy, ran alongside and exposed herself to much danger. Barney stood by one of the guns as the enemy came near and was about to apply the match, when the bold commander commanded him to desist. Barney, whose spirit revolted at such a cause, threw his matchstick at the captain with such force that the iron point stuck in the door of the roundhouse. This, in a youth not 17, urged well for the pugnacity of the man. At the end of this cruise, he volunteered on board the schooner Wasp, in which he soon had a brush with the Roebuck and another frigate, and with the aid of some galleys in which he had a command, the enemy was forced to retreat, with more loss than honor. Barney, for his good conduct in this affair, was appointed to the command of the sloop Sachem, with the commission of lieutenant before he was 17. Before the cruise, however, Captain Robinson took command of the Sachem, which soon had an action with a letter of marque of superior force and numbers. It was well contested, and nearly half the crew of the brig were killed or wounded. In about 2 hours, the letter of marque struck. The captors secured a valuable prize in a cargo of rum and also a magnificent turtle intended as a present to Lord North, whose name was marked on the shell. This acceptable West Indian, Lieutenant Barney, presented to a better man than it had been designed for he gave it to the Hun. R. Morris. On the return of the Sachem, both officers were transferred to a fine brig of 14 guns, the Andrew Doria, which forthwith captured the racehorse of 12 guns and a picked crew. This vessel was of the Royal Navy and had been detached by the Admiral purposely to take the Doria. On this voyage a Snow was captured, in which the Lieutenant PG 322 went as prize master, making up the crew partly of the prisoners. Being hard by an enemy's ship, he discovered signs of mutiny among his crew and shot the ringleader in the shoulder, a proceeding that offered so little encouragement to his comrades that they obeyed orders and made sail, but it was too late to escape. The purser of the frigate which captured him was on a subsequent occasion so much excited as to strike Barney, who knocked him down, and went further in his resentment than fair fighting permits, for he kicked him down the gangway. The commander obliged the purser to apologize to Barney. Having been captured in the Virginia frigate, which ran aground at the Capes and was deserted by her commander, Barney, with 500 other prisoners, was sent round in the St. Albans frigate to New York. As the prisoners were double in number to the crew, Barney formed a plan of taking the ship, which was defeated or prevented by the treachery of a Frenchman. Barney was a prisoner at New York for 5 months, after which he took the command of a schooner of 2 guns and 8 men with a cargo of tobacco for St. Eustatia, for he was better pleased to do a little than to do nothing. He was, however, taken, after a running fight, by boarding, by a privateer of 4 large guns and 60 men. His next cruise was with his friend Robinson, in a private ship of 10 guns and 35 men, in which they encountered the British privateer Rosebud of 16 guns and 120 men. On the return, a letter of marque of 16 guns and 70 men was captured. The lieutenant had now prize money enough to be converted, on his return, into a large bundle of continental bills, which he stowed away in a chaise box on taking a journey, but which he could not find when he arrived at his destination. He kept his own secret, however, and went to sea again, second in command of the United States ship Saratoga of 16 9-pounders. The first prize was a ship of 12 guns, captured after an action of a few minutes. On the next day, the Saratoga hoisted English colors and came alongside a ship which had 2 brigs in company. Then, running up the American ensign, she poured in a broadside, while Lieutenant Barney, with 50 men, boarded the enemy. The immediate result was the conquest of a ship of 32 guns and 90 men. The 2 brigs, one of 14 and the other of 4 guns, were also captured. The division of prize money would have made the officers rich, but no PG 323 division took place, for all but the Saratoga were captured by a 74 and several frigates. Lieutenant Barney was furnished with bed and board on deck, and with him bed and board were synonymous terms, but he was allowed to choose the softest plank he could find. In England, he was confined in prison, from which he escaped, and after various adventures, arrived at Beverly, Massachusetts, and as soon as he landed, was offered the command of a privateer of 20 guns. On his arrival at Philadelphia, he accepted the command of one of several vessels, cruising against the enemy's barges and the refugee boats that infested the Delaware River and Bay. His ship was the Hyder Ally, a small vessel of 16 6-pounders. As a superior vessel of the enemy was approaching, Barney directed his steersman to interpret his commands by the rule of contraries. When the enemy was ranging alongside, Barney cried out, "Hard a port." The helmsman clapped his helm the other way, and the enemy's jib-boom caught in the fore rigging and held her in a position to be raked, and never was the operation of raking more suddenly or effectually performed. The British flag came down in less than half an hour, and the captors made little delay for compliments, for a frigate from the enemy was rapidly approaching. The prize was the General Marle of the Royal Navy, with 29-pounders and 136 men, nearly double the force and metal of the captors. After the peace, Commodore Barney made a partial settlement in Kentucky and became a favorite with the old hunters of that pleasant land. He was appointed clerk of the District Court of Maryland and also an auctioneer. He also engaged in commerce when his business led him to Cape Francois during the insurrection, and where he armed his crew and fought his way to carry off some specie which he had secreted in barrels of coffee. On his return, he was captured by a pirate, which called herself an English privateer. Barney, however, was a bad prisoner, and with a couple of his hands rose upon the buccaneers and captured their ship. In this situation, it was no time for Argus himself to sleep, with more than an eye at a time. The Commodore slept only by day in an armed chair on deck, with his sword between his legs and pistols in his belt, while his cook and boatswain, well armed, stood the watch at his side. On another occasion, he was captured in the West Indies by an English frigate, where he received the usual British courtesies, and he was tried in Jamaica for piracy and 100. It is needless PG 324 to say that, though in an enemy's country, he was acquitted by acclamation. This accusation originated with the commander of the frigate, who, however, prudently kept out of sight, though an officer in the same frigate expressed at a coffee house a desire to meet Barney without knowing that he was present, that he might have an opportunity to settle accounts with the rascal. The rascal bestowed upon the officer the compliments that were usual on such an occasion, and tweaked that part of his head that is so prominent in an elephant. We cannot follow the Commodore through his subsequent fortunes and adventures. In France, he received the hug fraternal of the President of the Convention and the commission of captain of the highest grade in the Navy. He fitted out several vessels of his own to harass the British trade, in which he was very successful. He received the command of 2 frigates, which were almost wrecked in a storm, though he succeeded in saving them. In the last war, his services are more immediately in our memories. Naval battles of the United States. The depredations committed on American commerce in the Mediterranean by the piratical corsairs of the Barbary powers induced Congress in 1794 to authorize the formation of a naval force for its protection. 4 ships of 44 guns each and 2 of 36 were ordered to be built. Captain Thomas Truxton was one of the first 6 captains appointed by the President at the organization of the naval establishment in 1794. He was appointed to the command of the constellation of 36 guns and ordered to protect the commerce of the United States in the West Indies from PG 325, the ravages of the French. On the 9th of February, 1799, he captured the French frigate Insurgent, of which 29 of the crew were killed and 44 wounded. The Constellation had but 1 man killed and 2 wounded. In 1800, the Constellation engaged with the French frigate Vengeance of 54 guns near Guadeloupe, but owing to the darkness of the night, the latter escaped, after having thrice struck her colors and lost 160 men in the engagement. The same year, the United States frigate Boston captured the French national corvette Le Berceau. In the month of August, 1801, Captain Sterrett of the United States schooner Enterprise of 12 guns and 90 men fell in, off Malta, with a Tripolitan cruiser of 14 guns and 85 men. In this action, the Tripolitans thrice hauled down her colors and thrice perfidiously renewed the conflict. 50 of her men were killed and wounded. The Enterprise did not lose a man. Captain Sterrett's instructions not permitting him to make a prize of the cruiser, he ordered her crew to throw overboard all their guns and powder, and to go and tell their countrymen the treatment they might expect from a nation determined to pay tribute only in powder and ball. On her arrival at Tripoli, so great was the terror produced that the sailors abandoned the cruisers then fitting out, and not a man could be procured to navigate them. The Tripolitan cruisers continuing to harass the vessels of the United States, Congress determined in 1803 to fit out a fleet that should chastise their insolence. The squadron consisted of the Constitution, 44 guns, the Philadelphia, 44, the Argus, 18, the Siren, 16, the Nautilus, 16, the Vixen, 16, and the Enterprise, 14. Commodore Preble was appointed to the command of this squadron in May 1803, and on the 13th of August, sailed in the Constitution for the Mediterranean. Having adjusted the difficulties which had sprung up with the Emperor of Morocco, he turned his whole attention to Tripoli. The season was, however, too far advanced for active operations. On the 31st of October, the Philadelphia, being at 9 o'clock in the morning, about 5 leagues to the westward of Tripoli, discovered a sail in shore, standing before the wind to the eastward. The Philadelphia immediately gave chase. The sail hoisted Tripolitan colors and continued her course near the shore. The Philadelphia opened a fire upon her, PG 326, and continued it till 11:30, when being in 7 fathoms water and finding her fire could not prevent the vessel entering Tripoli, she gave up the pursuit. In beating off, she ran on a rock, not laid down in any chart, distant 4.5 miles from the town. A boat was immediately lowered to sound. The greatest depth of water was found to be astern. In order to back her off, all sails were laid aback, the topgallant sails loosened, 3 anchors thrown away from the bows, the water in the hold started, and all the guns thrown overboard, excepting a few abaft to defend the ship against the attacks of the Tripolitan gunboats, then firing at her. All this, however, proved ineffectual, as did also the attempt to light her forward by cutting away her foremast. The Philadelphia had already withstood the attack of the numerous gunboats for 4 hours, when a large reinforcement coming out of Tripoli, and being herself deprived of every means of resistance and defense, she was forced to strike about sunset. The Tripolitans immediately took possession of her and made prisoners of the officers and men, in number 300. 48 hours afterwards, the wind blowing inshore, the Tripolitans got the frigate off and towed her into the harbor. On the 14th of December, Commodore Preble sailed from Malta, in company with the Enterprise, commanded by Lieutenant Stephen Decatur. When the latter was informed of the loss of the Philadelphia, he immediately formed a plan of recapturing and destroying her, which he proposed to Commodore Preble. At first the Commodore thought the projected enterprise too hazardous, but at length granted his consent. Lieutenant Decatur then selected for the enterprise the ketch Intrepid, lately captured by him. This vessel he manned with 70 volunteers, chiefly of his own crew, and on the 3d of February sailed from Syracuse, accompanied by the brig Siren, Lieutenant Stewart. After a tempestuous passage of 15 days, the 2 vessels arrived off the harbor of Tripoli towards the close of day. It was determined that at 10 o'clock in the evening the Intrepid should enter the harbor, accompanied by the boats of the Siren. But a change of wind had separated the two vessels 6 or 8 miles. As delay might prove fatal, Lieutenant Decatur entered the harbor alone about 8 o'clock. The Philadelphia lay within half-gun shot of the Bashaw's castle and principal battery. On her starboard quarter lay 2 Tripolitan cruisers within 2 cables' length, and on the starboard PG-327 bow a number of gunboats within half-gun shot. All her guns were mounted and loaded. 3 hours were, in consequence of the lightness of the wind, consumed in passing 3 miles. When being within 200 yards of the Philadelphia, they were hailed from her and ordered to anchor on peril of being fired into. The pilot on board the Intrepid was ordered to reply that all their anchors were lost. The Americans had advanced within 50 yards of the frigate when the wind died away into a calm. Lieutenant Decatur ordered a rope to be taken out and fastened to the 4 chains of the frigate, which was done, and the Intrepid warped alongside. It was not till then the Tripolitans suspected them to be an enemy, and their confusion in consequence was great. As soon as the vessels were sufficiently near, Lieutenant Decatur sprang on board the frigate and was followed by Midshipman Morris. It was a minute before the remainder of the crew succeeded in mounting after them, but the Turks, crowded together on the quarter-deck, were in too great consternation to take advantage of this delay. As soon as a sufficient number of Americans gained the deck, they rushed upon the Tripolitans, who were soon overpowered, and about 20 of them were killed. After taking possession of the ship, a firing commenced from the Tripolitan batteries and castle, and from 2 cruisers near the ship. A number of launches were also seen rowing about in the harbor, whereupon Lieutenant Decatur resolved to remain in the frigate, for there he would be enabled to make the best defense. Perceiving that the launches kept at a distance, he ordered the frigate to be set on fire, which was immediately done, and so effectually that with difficulty was the Intrepid preserved. A favorable breeze at this moment sprung up, which soon carried them out of the harbor. None of the Americans were killed, and only 4 wounded. For this heroic achievement Lieutenant Decatur was promoted to the rank of post captain. His commission was dated on the day he destroyed the Philadelphia. After the destruction of the Philadelphia frigate, Commodore Preble was, during the spring and early part of the summer, employed in keeping up the blockade of the harbor of Tripoli, in preparing for an attack upon the town, and in cruising. A prize that had been taken was put in commission and called the Scourge. A loan of 6 gunboats and 2 bomb vessels, completely fitted for service, was obtained from the King of Naples. Permission was also given to take 12 or PG-328-15 Neapolitans on board each boat to serve under the American flag. With this addition to his force, the Commodore on the 21st of July joined the vessels off Tripoli. The number of men engaged in the service amounted to 1,060. On the Tripolitan castle and batteries, 115 guns were mounted, 55 of which were pieces of heavy ordnance, the others long 18 and 12-pounders. In the harbor were 19 gunboats carrying each a long brass 18 or 24-pounder in the bow, and 2 howitzers abaft, also 2 schooners of 8 guns each, a brig of 10 and 2 galleys of 4 guns each. In addition to the ordinary Turkish garrison and the crews of the armed vessels, estimated at 3,000, upwards of 20,000 Arabs had been assembled for the defense of the city. The weather prevented the squadron from approaching the city until the 28th, when it anchored within 2 miles and a half of the fortifications. But the wind suddenly shifting and increasing to a gale, the Commodore was compelled to return. On the 3d of August, he again approached to within 2 or 3 miles of the batteries. Having observed that several of the enemy's boats were stationed without the reef of rocks covering the entrance, he made signal for the squadron to come within speaking distance, to communicate to the several commanders his intention of attacking the shipping and batteries. The gunboats and bomb ketches were immediately manned and prepared for action. The former were arranged in 2 divisions of 3 each. At 1:30, the squadron stood in for the batteries. At 2, the gunboats were cast off. At 2:30, signal was made for the bomb ketches and gunboats to advance and attack. At 2:45, the signal was given for a general action. It commenced by the bomb ketches throwing shells into the town. A tremendous fire immediately commenced from the enemy's batteries and vessels of at least 200 guns. It was immediately returned by the American squadron, now within musket shot of the principal batteries. At this moment, Captain Decatur, with the 3 gunboats under his command, attacked the enemy's eastern division, consisting of 9 gunboats. He was soon in the midst of them. The fire of the cannon and musketry was immediately changed to a desperate attack with bayonet, spear, and saber. Captain Decatur, having grappled a Tripolitan boat, PG 329, and boarded her with only 15 Americans, in 10 minutes her decks were cleared and she was captured. 3 Americans were wounded. At this moment, Captain Decatur was informed that the gunboat commanded by his brother had engaged and captured a boat belonging to the enemy, but that his brother, as he stepped on board, was treacherously shot by the Tripolitan commander, who made off with his boat. Captain Decatur immediately pursued the murderer, who was retreating within the lines. Having succeeded in coming alongside, he boarded with only 11 men. A doubtful contest of 20 minutes ensued. Decatur immediately attacked the Tripolitan commander, who was armed with a spear and cutlass. In parrying the Turk's spear, Decatur broke his sword close to the hilt and received a slight wound in the right arm and breast, but having seized the spear he closed, and after a violent struggle, both fell, Decatur uppermost. The Turk then drew a dagger from his belt, but Decatur caught his arm, drew a pistol from his pocket, and shot him. While they were struggling, the crew of both vessels rushed to the assistance of their commanders. And so desperate had the contest around them been that it was with difficulty that Decatur extricated himself from the killed and wounded that had fallen around him. In this affair, an American manifested the most heroic courage and attachment to his commander. Decatur, in the struggle, was attacked in the rear by a Tripolitan who had aimed a blow at his head, which must have proved fatal, had not this generous-minded tar, then dangerously wounded and deprived of the use of both his hands, rushed between him and the saber, the stroke of which he received in his head, whereby the skull was fractured. This hero, however, survived, and afterwards received a pension from his grateful country. All the Americans but 4 were wounded. Captain Decatur brought both of his prizes safe to the American squadron. 2 successive attacks were afterwards made upon Tripoli, and the batteries effectually silenced. The humiliation of this barbarous power was of advantage to all nations. The Pope made a public declaration that the United States, though in their infancy, had, in this affair, done more to humble the anti-Christian barbarians on that coast than all the European states had done for a long series of time. Sir Alexander Ball, a distinguished commander in the British Navy, addressed his congratulations to Commodore Preble. PG 330, after the junction of the 2 squadrons, Commodore Preble obtained leave to return home. This he did with the greater pleasure, as it would give the command of a frigate to Captain Decatur. On his return to the United States, he was received and treated everywhere with that distinguished attention which he had so fully merited. Congress voted him their thanks and requested the President to present him with an emblematical medal. Our limits will only allow us to glance briefly at a few of the remaining victories of the American Navy. A formal declaration of war against Great Britain was passed by Congress on the 18th of June, 1812. On the 19th of August, the memorable capture of the British frigate Guerriere by the Constitution under Captain Hull took place. On the 19th of October, the British sloop of war Frolic was taken by the Wasp, commanded by Captain Jacob Jones. Before the latter could escape, however, with her prize being in a very disabled state, she was captured by the British 74 Poictiers. On the 25th of October, the United States under Commodore Decatur fell in with and captured, off the Western Isles, the British frigate Macedonian, mounting 49 guns and carrying 306 men. The Macedonian had 106 men killed and wounded. The United States 5 killed and 7 wounded. The victory of the Constitution over the Java followed next and was succeeded by that of the Hornet, commanded by Captain Lawrence, over the Peacock. The loss of this brave officer in the subsequent engagement between the Chesapeake and Shannon was generally lamented by his countrymen. On the 1st of September, 1813, the British brig Boxer of 14 guns was captured by the United States brig Enterprise, commanded by Lieutenant William Burroughs, who fell in the engagement. We must close our notice of American naval history by a brief sketch of some of the most interesting cruises and engagements. Cruise of the Wasp. On the 1st of May, 1814, the United States sloop of war Wasp, of 18 guns and 174 men, Captain Blakely, commander, sailed from Portsmouth, NH, on a cruise, and on the 28th of June, in latitude 4836, longitude 1115. After having made several captures, she fell PG 331 in with, engaged, and after an action of 19 minutes, captured His Britannic Majesty's sloop of war Reindeer, William Manners, Esquire, commander. The Reindeer mounted 16 24-pound carronades, 2 long 6 or 9-pounders, and a shifting 12-pound carronade, with a complement on board of 118 men. She was literally cut to pieces in a line with her ports. Her upper works, boats, and spare spars were one complete wreck, and a breeze springing up the next day after the action, her foremast went by the board. When the prisoners having been taken on board the Wasp, she was set on fire and soon blew up. The loss on board the Reindeer was 23 killed and 42 wounded, her captain being among the former. On board the Wasp 5 were killed and 21 wounded. More than one half of the wounded enemy were, in consequence of the severity and extent of their wounds, put on board a Portuguese brig and sent to England. The loss of the Americans, although not so severe as that of the British, was owing, in a degree, to the proximity of the two vessels during the action and the extreme smoothness of the sea, but chiefly in repelling boarders. On the 8th of July, the Wasp put into L'Orient, France, after capturing an additional number of prizes, where she remained until the 27th of August, when she again sailed on a cruise. On the 1st of September, she fell in with the British sloop of war Avon, of 20 guns, commanded by Captain Arbuthnot, and after an action of 45 minutes, compelled her to surrender, her crew being nearly all killed and wounded. The guns were then ordered to be secured, and a boat lowered from the Wasp in order to take possession of the prize. In the act of lowering the boat, a second enemy's vessel was discovered astern and standing towards the Wasp. Captain Blakely immediately ordered his crew to their quarters, prepared everything for action, and awaited her coming up. In a few minutes after, 2 additional sails were discovered bearing down upon the Wasp. Captain Blakely stood off with the expectation of drawing the first from its companions, but in this he was disappointed. She continued to approach until she came close to the stern of the Wasp, when she, hauled by the wind, fired her broadside, which injured the Wasp but trifling, and retraced her steps to join her consorts. Captain Blakely was now necessitated to abandon the Avon, which had by this time become a total wreck, and which soon after sunk, the surviving part of her crew having barely time to escape to the other vessels. PG 332 on board of the Avon 40 were killed, and 60 wounded. The loss sustained by the Wasp was 2 killed and 1 wounded. The Wasp afterwards continued her cruise, making great havoc among the English merchant vessels and privateers, destroying an immense amount of the enemy's property. From the 1st of May until the 20th of September, she had captured 15 vessels, most of which she destroyed. Hornet and Penguin. On the 23rd of March, 1815, as the Hornet, commanded by Captain Biddle, was about to anchor off the north end of the island of Tristan da Cunha, a sail was seen to the southward, which, at 40 minutes past 1, hoisted English colors and fired a gun. The Hornet immediately luffed to, hoisted an ensign, and gave the enemy a broadside. A quick and well-directed fire was kept up from the Hornet, the enemy gradually drifting nearer, with an intention, as Captain Biddle supposed, to board. The enemy's bowsprit came in between the main and mizzen rigging on the starboard side of the Hornet, giving him an opportunity to board if he had wished, but no attempt was made. There was a considerable swell, and as the sea lifted the Hornet ahead, the enemy's bowsprit carried away her mizzen shrouds, stern davits, and spanker boom, and hung upon her larboard quarter. At this moment, an officer called out that they had surrendered. Captain Biddle directed the Marines to stop firing, and while asking if they had surrendered, received a wound in the neck. The enemy just then got clear of the Hornet, and his foremast and bowsprit being both gone, and perceiving preparations to give him another broadside, he again called out that he had surrendered. It was with great difficulty that Captain Biddle could restrain his crew from firing into him again, as it was certain that he had fired into the Hornet after having surrendered. From the firing of the first gun to the last time the enemy cried out that he had surrendered was exactly 22 minutes. The vessel proved to be the British brig Penguin, of 20 guns, a remarkable fine vessel of her class, and 132 men, 12 of them supernumeraries from the Medway 74, received on board in consequence of their being ordered to cruise for the privateer Young Wasp. The Penguin had 14 killed and 28 wounded. PG 333 among the killed was Captain Dickenson, who fell at the close of the action. As she was completely riddled and so crippled as to be incapable of being secured, and being at a great distance from the United States, Captain Biddle ordered her to be scuttled and sunk. The Hornet did not receive a single round shot in her hull, and though much cut in her sails and rigging, was soon made ready for further service. Her loss was 1 killed and 11 wounded. Algerine War. Immediately after the ratification of peace with Great Britain in February 1815, Congress, in consequence of the hostile conduct of the Regency of Algiers, declared war against that power. A squadron was immediately fitted out, under the command of Commodore Decatur, consisting of the Guerrière, Constellation, and Macedonian frigates, the Ontario and Epervier sloops of war, and the schooners Spark, Spitfire, Torch, and Flambeau. Another squadron under Commodore Bainbridge was soon to follow this armament, on the arrival of which, it was understood, Commodore Decatur would return to the United States in a single vessel, leaving the command of the whole combined force to Commodore Bainbridge. The force under Commodore Decatur rendezvoused at New York, from which port they sailed the 20th day of May, 1815, and arrived in the Bay of Gibraltar in 25 days, after having previously communicated with Cadiz and Tangier. In the passage, the Spitfire, Torch, Firefly, and Ontario separated different times from the squadron in gales, but all joined again at Gibraltar, with the exception of the Firefly, which sprung her masts and put back to New York to refit. Having learned at Gibraltar that the Algerine squadron, which had been out into the Atlantic, had undoubtedly passed up the straits, and that information of the arrival of the American force had been sent to Algiers by persons in Gibraltar, Commodore Decatur determined to proceed without delay up the Mediterranean, in the hope of intercepting the enemy before he could return to Algiers or gain a neutral port. On the 17th of June, off Cape de Gat, he fell in with and captured the Algerine frigate Mazota in a running fight of 25 minutes. After 2 broadsides, the Algerines ran below. The Guerrière had 4 men wounded by musketry. The Algerines had about 30 killed, according to the statement page 334 of the prisoners, who amounted to 406. In this affair, the famous Algerine admiral or Rise, Hamida, who had long been the terror of this sea, was cut in 2 by a cannon shot. On the 19th of June, off Cape Palos, the squadron fell in with and captured an Algerine brig of 22 guns. The brig was chased close to the shore, where she was followed by the Epervier, Spark, Torch, and Spitfire, to whom she surrendered after losing 23 men. No Americans were either killed or wounded. The captured brig, with most of the prisoners on board, was sent into Carthagena. From Cape Palos, the American squadron proceeded to Algiers, where it arrived the 28th of June. The treaty which Commodore Decatur finally succeeded in negotiating with the Dey was highly favorable. The principal articles were that no tribute under any pretext or in any form whatever should ever be required by Algiers from the United States of America, that all Americans in slavery should be given up without ransom, that compensation should be made for American vessels captured or property seized or detained at Algiers, that the persons and property of American citizens found on board an enemy's vessel should be sacred, that vessels of either party putting into port should be supplied with provisions at market price, and if necessary to be repaired, should land their cargoes without paying duty, that if a vessel belonging to either party should be cast on shore, she should not be given up to plunder, or if attacked by an enemy within cannon shot of a fort, should be protected, and no enemy be permitted to follow her when she went to sea within 24 hours. In general, the rights of Americans on the ocean and land were fully provided for in every instance, and it was particularly stipulated that all citizens of the United States taken in war should be treated as prisoners of war are treated by other nations, and not as slaves, but held subject to an exchange without ransom. After concluding this treaty, so highly honorable and advantageous to this country, the commissioners gave up the captured frigate and brig to their former owners. Commodore Decatur dispatched Captain Lewis in the Epivere, bearing the treaty to the United States, and leaving Mr. Shaler at Algiers as Consul General to the Barbary States, proceeded with the rest of the squadron to Tunis, with the exception of 2 schooners under Captain Gamble, sent to convoy the Algerine vessels home from Carthagena. Having PG 335 obtained from the Bashaw of Tunis a full restoration in money for certain outrages which had been sustained by American citizens, the squadron proceeded to Tripoli, where Commodore Decatur made a similar demand for a similar violation of the treaty subsisting between the United States and the Bashaw, who had permitted 2 American vessels to be taken from under the guns of his castle by a British sloop of war, and refused protection to an American cruiser lying within his jurisdiction. Restitution of the full value of these vessels was demanded, and the money, amounting to $25,000, paid by the Bashaw into the hands of the American consul. After the conclusion of this affair, the American consular flag, which Mr. Jones, the consul, had struck in consequence of the violation of neutrality above mentioned, was hoisted in the presence of the foreign agents and saluted from the castle with 31 guns. In addition to the satisfaction thus obtained for unprovoked aggressions, the Commodore had the pleasure of obtaining the release of 10 captives, 2 Danes and 8 Neapolitans, the latter of whom he landed at Messina. After touching at Messina and Naples, the squadron sailed for Carthagena on the 31st of August, where Commodore Decatur was in expectation of meeting the relief squadron under Commodore Bainbridge. On joining that officer at Gibraltar, he relinquished his command and sailed in the Guerriere for the United States, where he arrived on the 12th of November, 1815. Everything being done previous to the arrival of the 2nd Division of the squadron, under Commodore Bainbridge, that gallant officer had no opportunity of distinguishing himself. Pursuant to his instructions, he exhibited this additional force before Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, where they were somewhat surprised at the appearance of the Independent 74. Commodore Bainbridge sailed from Gibraltar 36 hours before the Guerriere and arrived at Boston the 15th of November. Page 336. Address to the ocean. Likeness of heaven. Agent of power. Man is thy victim. Shipwreck thy dower. Spices and jewels. From valley and sea. Armies and banners are buried in thee. What are the riches of Mexico's mines to the wealth that far down in thy deep waters shine? The proud navies that cover the conquering west, thou fling'st them to death with one heave of thy breast. From the high hills that view thy wreck-making shore, when the bride of the mariners shrieks at thy roar, when like lambs in the tempest, or mews in the blast, on thy ridge broken billows, the canvas is cast. How humbling to one with a heart and a soul to look on thy greatness and list to its roll, to think how that heart in cold ashes shall be, while the voice of eternity rises from thee.